This war isn't ending in a Ukrainian victory parade, as some might have hoped for. The battlefield is grinding down, Western support is fracturing as we're currently seeing, and Russia's just digging in for the long haul. No surprise there. At this stage, there are only four ways this war ends. Two are far more likely than the rest. As outlined in the Times article, How Could the Russian-Ukraine War End? Four possible scenarios. The possibilities range from negotiated settlements to prolonged conflict. But one thing is certain, Ukraine isn't calling the shots, and that is something we can all agree on. Because at this point, it's not just about Ukraine. It's about who really gets to decide the terms of peace. Will Kiev somehow turn things around? Will Russia dictate the outcome? Or will this war settle into something neither side wants? Let's break that all down. So, as we continue to explore all the possible outcomes, we have to face the harsh reality that not all scenarios favor Ukraine. The toughest to imagine is a Ukrainian defeat, and unfortunately, it's a very real possibilities. Let's start off with the first one, Ukrainian defeat, Russian victory. So realistically speaking here, Ukraine losing this war outright is one of the most probable outcomes to happen in the near future. The country is almost entirely reliant on Western military aid, and without it, sustaining the fight is definitely impossible. The US alone has provided over $80 billion in security assistance. But with political shifts in Washington and growing fatigue in Europe, this pipeline isn't guaranteed to last forever. If the funding and supply slow down while Russia continues ramping up its own production, Ukraine's ability to resist will collapse. Let's talk about the numbers here. Ukraine is truly suffering far worse casualty rate than Russia. According to leaked Pentagon documents, Ukrainian forces were losing men at a 7-to-1 ratio at certain points in the war. Even more conservative estimates put it at a 3-to-1 in Russia's favor, meaning for that every Russian soldier lost, Ukraine is losing multiple in comparison. The lack of manpower has already forced Ukraine to extend its mobilization efforts, drafting older men and struggling to replace battlefield losses. Meanwhile, Russia, despite its high casualty count, has a much larger population to draw from and is producing over 100 tanks per month, compared to Ukraine's reliance on Western-supplied armor. If Ukraine's defenses break under these conditions, which is currently happening, then Kiev itself could be threatened, and Russia would install a pro-Kremlin regime or something close to it. This would end Ukraine as an independent state and push Russia right up to NATO's doorstep. Countries like Poland and the Baltics would have to brace for heightened tensions, while the West would have to face a humiliating geopolitical failure. This, for me, is the most probable outcome for how this war will end, since it literally is on Russia's doorstep. They will dictate the terms to the West. The Ukrainian loss ratio compared to Russia's armed forces makes this clear. They cannot sustain this war forever. They're headed for a 1945 German-style collapse, and neither mercenaries nor covert Western forces will change that. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Russia ends up in Kiev by the end of this conflict. Some have speculated that this could drag on for another year or two. But looking at the front line, especially in southeastern Donbass, it's clear Ukraine can't hold out much longer. Now, some NATO fanatics here will claim that if we just keep supplying Ukraine, we can either help them win or at least make Russia's victory more painful. So basically, you're admitting that you're willing to sacrifice countless Ukrainians and pour endless American tax dollars into this, correct? Now, when we all know where the US aid is truly going to, and let's be real, wasting all the able-bodied men means there won't be anyone left to use those weapons and vehicles. No amount of Western aid will change the battlefield unless you're giving them nukes. Then we all lose, of course, in that scenario. When this all plays out, more like when rather than if, NATO's reputation and the West's global dominance will take a massive hit for sure. In the end, Russia will have created a military loss for NATO by making an example of its Ukrainian proxy army, shifting global security toward a multipolar world, and BlackRock and other Western investors will lose out on the land they bought for resource extraction there, which is a very, very good thing. As we examine the possibilities of Ukraine's outright defeat, the alternative scenario to consider is one where the conflict reaches a temporary halt or a negotiated settlement. However, this doesn't necessarily lead to peace. It could result in a deal heavily skewed toward Russia's interests, leaving Ukraine in a vulnerable position. Let's dive into that next, shall we? Number 2, unfavorable peace deal for Ukraine. If outright defeat doesn't happen, this is the next most probable outcome. Even if Ukraine manages to hold the line, it may be forced into a negotiated settlement that overwhelmingly favors Russia. With Ukraine struggling to sustain its military operations and Western patience wearing thin, Kiev could be pressured into a deal that cements Russian control over occupied territories. Right now, Moscow holds about 18% of Ukraine's land. Unless Ukraine can retake it, which seems increasingly unlikely, any future peace deal would likely make these territorial losses permanent. The casualty disparity also plays into this. By late 2023, estimates suggested Ukraine had lost anywhere between 400,000 and 500,000 soldiers, including the dead and wounded into those numbers. While Russia's total losses were significantly lower, despite the perception of mass casualties, the loss ratio remains unfavorable for Ukraine, and that's a key reason why it's losing ground. If the West decides that keeping Ukraine afloat is no longer worth the cost, the pressure to negotiate will be immense. Such a deal would force Ukraine to remain neutral, abandon NATO's ambitions, and accept partial demilitarization. The problem here? This wouldn't be true peace, just temporary pause before Russia regroups and comes back stronger. Ukraine has been down this road before with the Minsk agreements, and those deals ultimately failed to prevent full-scale war. This scenario means Ukraine survives, but in a weakened state, vulnerable to future Russian aggression. An unfavorable peace deal is becoming more and more likely now than the last two scenarios, in my opinion, which I'll get to. It's the safer route, of course. If Ukraine wants to keep some semblance of an independence and also saving face, then they should do so. But for that to happen, Ukraine would have to change its constitution and give in to Russia's security concerns with no roadblocks, of course. Foreign aid and Western citizens' tolerance are definitely running thin as it is. So, the Ukrainian government needs to realize peace is better than being outright broken by its neighbors. Just being honest here. We all know that Western countries that have supported Ukraine are now pushing for the war to end this year by forcing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. But, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine's constitution bans negotiations, and breaking that would come with severe punishments. Zelensky knows exactly what would happen to him and anyone else who tries to make an unfavorable deal with Russia. He's in a catch-22 here. He has to obey what his Western backers want and say, but he can't because of the constitutional amendment he wrote himself, unironically. Now, I think Trump will force Ukraine down this path, which is what we're currently seeing, and NATO will follow suit. But Putin will ultimately decide the terms, which will likely be worse than the one in March of 2022, before Boris Johnson botched that deal. So the real question here is, will Putin even trust another paper deal after the last two agreements? Who knows? We shall see. Moving forward, let's explore another potential outcome, a ceasefire that freezes the conflict for a period. This could temporarily halt the fighting, but it might not offer a lasting solution. Would a ceasefire offer a genuine chance for stability, or would it only create a protracted stalemate? Let's examine this possibility. Number 3, ceasefire leading to a prolonged stalemate. A ceasefire without a real resolution could happen if neither side can achieve a breakthrough. At this point, both Ukraine and Russia are showing signs of exhaustion. Ukraine is struggling with manpower and ammunition, while Russia has taken heavy losses but maintains battlefield momentum. If a prolonged stalemate develops, international pressure for a ceasefire could increase. But let's be clear, a ceasefire isn't the same as peace. It would likely freeze the front lines, with Russia solidifying control over occupied territories, and Ukraine unable to reclaim them. Think of it like Korea. Technically, the Korean War never ended, and decades later, tensions still remain. This scenario would leave Ukraine in a permanent state of insecurity, consistently bracing for the next Russian offensive. Another issue is that Russia has no real incentive to stick to a ceasefire permanently. If it believes Ukraine is still a threat, it will simply use the pause to rearm and strike again later. Meanwhile, Ukraine would be left in limbo, with millions of displaced citizens unable to return home and no clear path toward NATO or EU integration. This outcome avoids immediate defeat, but keeps Ukraine locked in a geopolitical deadlock. Now, personally, I don't think this is what Russia would want on their border again after the two failed Minsk agreements, because the former Western leaders all lied to Putin by freezing this conflict for over 8 years just to train Ukraine's armed forces to go up against Russian forces again. So, let me propose this to you all. Why would Russia repeat the same mistake 3 times? Like, seriously, why? Not to mention, the West has proposed sending military peacekeepers who are basically covert NATO troops, which I actually covered in one of my videos. Russia will never allow that to happen because that's how this whole mess started in the first place. And even if a ceasefire were to be implemented, it wouldn't last as some people hope it would. There are way too many players here, and investments on both sides. Resources, land, money, new weapons, and security. All of these factors are why this war won't be a frozen conflict, no matter how much the West insists that it should be. Ukraine wouldn't be able to function as a state. It would just be a vassal state, drowning in unpayable debt as we're currently seeing. And as I'm currently speaking, Donald Trump has said he would want a return on investments by taking resources from Ukraine. But the problem is, most of those resources are either being fought over in Donbass or already in Russia's hands, making any forced freeze of the conflict nearly impossible. While a ceasefire may seem like a temporary relief, the most favorable scenario for Ukraine, a bit unlikely, would be a negotiated settlement that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty while also guaranteeing long-term security. Let's dive into this far less probable but potential ideal outcome. Number 4. Negotiated settlement with Western security guarantees. The best case scenario for Ukraine is one where it enters peace talks from a position of strength, forcing Russia to make concessions in exchange for long-term security guarantees. This would involve NATO or the EU providing Ukraine with security assurances that go beyond just weapons supply, such as missile defense systems, air support, and guarantees of non-aggression. In return, Ukraine might be expected to remain neutral, foregoing NATO membership in exchange for security under NATO's protection. However, such a deal requires both sides to have incentives to cooperate, and right now, Russia has little reason to negotiate on that. Ukraine is far more reliant on the West for aid, and Russia has the military advantage in terms of artillery and equipment. Ukraine would need to demonstrate that it can reclaim territory and impose heavy costs on Russia before such a deal can become feasible. But even the best case scenario, this kind of deal is more likely to be short term. Russia's long-term ambitions remains as a buffer zone stretching into Ukraine, which could spark another conflict years down the line if NATO doesn't fully commit to defending Ukraine. The main challenge here is balancing Ukraine's survival while providing Russia with enough face saving to retreat. Now, I'm not saying this scenario couldn't happen, but the likelihood of it actually being achievable is realistically only about 1%. Remember what I said earlier. Russia has a history of entering agreements like these, but only when they benefit Russia more than they benefit the West. Neither side is willing to cooperate because Russia doesn't see Ukraine's government as legitimate, and Ukraine views Russia as an imperialist invader. That means any negotiations, unfortunately, won't include Ukrainian representatives at all. Instead, it's going to be Russian representatives negotiating with American representatives, deciding whether negotiations will even happen in the first place. Because let's be real here, it's Western countries and leaders calling the shots, not Zelensky, when it comes to this geopolitical chess game in the proxy war. And if negotiations somehow does happen, which is where it's heading, Russia might settle for Ukraine being neutral, which was already one of their terms back in March of 2022. So, at the end of the day, this all depends on whether the West is willing to negotiate in a way that gives Russia what it actually wants, and it seems like that might be the case. While negotiated settlement or peace deal seems like a possible end, the reality is that the war in Ukraine may eventually come to an end on Russia's terms, as it is strategically positioned to push for that outcome. Let's discuss how this could unfold. Number 5. How the war will actually end. Russia's terms prevail. This is the cold reality. Russia will decide when and how this war ends. Ukraine is fighting hard, but its survival depends on outside help. Wars don't just stop because both sides are tired. They stop when one side can no longer sustain the fight. Russia has more manpower, a larger economy, and a government willing to absorb losses for a long-term strategic gain. Even if its casualty numbers are high, they're not high enough to cripple its war effort. Meanwhile, Ukraine is running out of soldiers faster than they can replace them, and its economy is collapsing under the strain of war. If Western support declines, Ukraine will be left with no good options. This doesn't mean Ukraine will fall overnight, but it does mean that over time, Russia will gain the upper hand. If the US or Europe loses interest, Russia will simply keep fighting until Ukraine is forced into submission. I really don't have much to add here because this is simply the reality of how this conflict will end. I hate to sound like a broken record here, but this is Russia's Cuban Missile Crisis, and their security concerns won't change. They'll settle this on the battlefield or through settlements on their own terms. The West can cry about democracy and freedom all they want, but was it really about freedom for Ukraine, or was it always about resources? Even Trump recently pointed out that this conflict started because of the West's obsession with resources, which makes sense. If they lose this war, it won't just damage NATO's and the EU image, it'll make them look like absolute fools on the world stage, which they currently are. Their whole narrative collapses. China solidifies control over East Asia, and the US dominance in the region, especially over Taiwan, is put into question. Geopolitically, if this war ends, with Russia making major gains, or outright taking most of Ukraine, then we're heading back to an old world order. That means a return to regionalism and imperialism instead of globalism, shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world that it used to be. Even Trump, and yes, surprisingly Marco Rubio, have acknowledged this is where things are headed, and Western leaders are furious about their investments going up in smoke as we're currently seeing. Russia winning whether on the battlefield or through negotiations in their favor, but that won't stop the West from meddling in Russia's neighboring countries, if that's all they have left. And that is all they can realistically do. So, to conclude my final thoughts here, it's all going to come down to what Russia wants, as I said all the way in the beginning. Not what the West wants, nor what Ukraine wants. And with recent shifts that the Trump administration is going for, it seems either that there will be some sort of deal that obviously favors Russia, while putting Ukraine and Europe on the sidelines as we're currently seeing, which now no one should be surprised at this point. And that includes you, NATO fanatics, while putting Ukraine and Europe on the sidelines, which now no one should be surprised at this point, because America is going to be focused on its own internal issues and on China. Not to mention, you're going to have Europe now pick up the pace in their defense spending and take over the Ukraine war in terms of becoming their problem. After all, this is the game of geopolitics, of course. I do also want to add one thing that is of concern to me and, of course, those who understand this conflict. A lot of NATO supporters and Ukrainian supporters, obviously, with their propaganda and spewing narratives on YouTube, need to be held into question now, especially with the whole leak of the US aid thing going to funding of Ukrainian propaganda, NATO propaganda, needs to be called in question. So I do want to add this final point. With the leak and exposure of the US aid debacle going about in America and perhaps in the world, leading many people such as myself who are realistic, I think it comes down to the question here for you all. All these pro-Ukrainian and NATO YouTubers and or pundits need to be called out. Because this is a serious concern on my part and many other people, we need to ask these pundits or YouTubers or blog posters, hey, were you paid by these people? You can, answer a yes or no, because this comes down to that. And we're now seeing a lot of them being, silent, especially on X, which I'm not surprised. Now, I'm not saying to, how would you say, berate these people. No, you could leave a comment or two, but I think they should be held responsible and accountable for pushing false narratives and false hope, leading people to support Ukraine and what it's doing. Not saying they can't, it's just not genuine in my opinion. And I don't want to say any names, but I have a lot of suspicion on a lot of them. But that's just my personal take here. So other than that, I know some of them will say, hey, but are you a Russian bot? Will you get paid by Russia or other countries that you would think that would be against NATO? And I would argue, no, I don't want to get paid by any other country. God forbid. I actually want to be realistic and stay neutral as much as one can, but also realistic. I'm not going to get paid by these people or organizations or countries. I want to be authentic, which is, again, why I'm telling you guys, hold these YouTubers accountable and responsible, because that is how it should be, in my opinion. Otherwise, thank you guys for listening. Have a great day.